Mappa Mundi is an exploration-focused tabletop RPG published by 3 Sail Studios following a successful Kickstarter. The most salient feature of this game is the fact that you investigate the appearance of mysterious, fantastical creatures in a fantasy setting, but under no circumstances do you fight these creatures or harm them. And I guess the second most important aspect of this game is that it's largely narrative in nature. You do roll dice, but not terribly often. Notably, the game comes with a 100-page campaign book that contains 4 essentially one-shot adventures, as well as a 20-page solo guide that adapts the game's rules into something that can be run as a journaling experience. In this video, I first want to show you the physical box set that this game comes as, then walk you through how a character is constructed, the core mechanics, show you how regions are presented, and then take you through my solo experience playing this game, where I was able to reveal some things about this game that make it truly unique. Some good, some bad. So the product I was sent was one box set. The box itself is really thick, solid cardboard with a smooth matte finish. When you pop it open, there is the regional map on the inside, and then front and center is the core rulebook, which runs about 225 pages. But let's dig a little further and take a look at these cards first. There are 2 little nooks for these cards, which are a variation of tarot size. These cards feel very different from normal playing or tarot cards. Instead of feeling slippery and therefore easy to shuffle, there's a gridded cloth texture on the back of each, and you can't really see it, but there's an almost rubberized friction to the surface, front and back. And that's fine because the game doesn't call for these cards to be shuffled. In fact, they're meant to stay in place on the table wherever you put them and hold their orientation. So the texture makes sense. As far as this first deck, it contains 36 different so-called journey cards. When you're constructing a scenario as the GM, you will pick just a few of these cards to comprise the environment for the session, and each environment carries with it distinct details and challenges that the PCs will face during the journey phase of the game. The reason to use cards is both to visually signal to the table where the fiction is currently taking place, as well as to denote whether that environment is in a peaceful or a hostile state by being either right side up or inverted on the table. If you'll notice, each journey card's artwork is bifurcated into a peaceful mode and a hostile mode. I think the actual artwork for these cards is phenomenal, by the way, a real standout feature. The other deck of cards actually contains a few elements. The vast majority of the cards are the monsters. So yeah, this game is kind of like a monster hunter RPG, except of course you're not hunting the monsters so much as you're seeking them out to study them, assuage them, appease them, or otherwise interact with them in a careful, considered, and informed manner. These creatures form the backbone of the game itself. They're at the center of each session, usually coming up at the end in a climactic fashion. And again, the artwork for these is amazing. Then at the end of this deck, you have a couple of generic creature cards and opportunity cards. These are cards that you add to your session deck to add a minor creature encounter or a narrative opportunity for players. The other thing that comes in this box is the core rulebook itself, of course. This is a very nicely constructed hardcover book. The end papers contain the regional map. The paper is actually a bit more matte than usual, but it's relatively heavy stock, so you definitely get that old tome feel. I'm going to go over the mechanics of the game in this video, but I just wanted to show you the print quality of this book here. And I'll say it again, the artwork for this game really takes the reading and playing experience up a couple of notches. But let's jump in and explore what kind of character you play in this game. The world is called Ekumene, and the continent you're on is called Ivasu. Not too long ago, there was a mysterious calamity that shook the world called the Flux, and it reduced human civilizations down, not exactly to post-apocalyptic levels, it's not entirely clear, but travel between continents is not currently possible, and wildlife changed, becoming more aggressive and erratic, as did the weather. Your character is a newly minted member of the Mappa Mundi Institute. You're a chronicler, someone who has sworn to study the monsters and creatures of the world and to do no harm to humans, animals, or the environment in the process. Which is to say, this game has a certain kind of experience in mind, and it's pretty important that everyone at the table is on the same page in that regard. When creating your chronicler, the first thing you do is give yourself a name and choose one of 4 licenses. You can think of these as the classes of this game. And they are Archivist, which is the academic archetype. You might have thought that everyone in this game would play as an Archivist given the mission of the Institute. This license subdivides into the specializations of Cartographer, Biologist, and Historian, which each require different abilities that you acquire over time. Actually, you'll notice here that as you eventually unlock a specialization, you then unlock higher tier abilities related to that specialization and eventually earn the title of Master within that field. You also have the Diviner. They're like mystics or seers. Their possible specializations are Cartomancer, Osteomancer, and Augur. Here's an example of what embodying those titles will actually give you. As a Cartomancer, once per adventure, you can peek at the GM's session deck and change its orientation, most likely from inverted to rightwise if you know what's good for you. Osteomancer gives you the choice of upgrading the core stats of 2 other party members, which are defined by step dice, I assume as a one-time only deal. Or you can give everyone in the party a reroll essentially 3 times per session. This subclass is called the Osteomancer and has to do with dice because in the game, the dice are referred to as bones. So, you know, Osteo, bones, Osteomancer. There is also the Fixer, who is characterized as both a social fixer, someone who is a smooth talker and negotiator, as well as a mechanical fixer, someone who can tinker and actually repair things. Well, I guess you make the choice as to what kind of fixer you want to be by choosing a specialization as either envoy, fabricator, or scavenger. And finally, there's the Guardian, who is meant to be a protector of the party. This one is a little tricky because you're not supposed to have combat in this game, and yet you have a whole class that is ostensibly armed and armored. If you take a look at their specializations, you'll see Warden, Survivalist, and Trapper, which are indeed not necessarily combat roles, but the fact is you can attack monsters and creatures, but it will just decrease the possibility of a successful mission overall. There's one other starting feature of your character that's vitally important, particularly when facing a monster or a creature, and that's your interactions. These are essentially another set of abilities separate from your core stats or your license class skills. Interactions are invoked during an encounter with a minor creature or a monster, ultimately to figure out their behavior. Selecting the appropriate interaction to use during an encounter will reveal these behaviors and further unlock the mystery of a creature or a monster. Notice that these interactions are narrative in nature. On that note, let's actually look at the core rules of this game. This is a narrative-first game. When your character is trying to solve any kind of problem, whether it be interacting with an NPC, the environment, or a creature or monster, you first want to look to your narratively defined class skills to see if anything applies to the situation, and then maybe to your interactions in certain cases. If nothing there will help, then you will look to your 4 core stats, which are called your training in this game. These 4 stats are defined by step dice, and you start with a D6 in one of them, a D4 in 2, and a D2 in your weakest training. Anytime you need to test your training in one of these abilities, you roll the die with the ability being tested. And if it's equal to or above the target set by the GM, then it's a success. These dice rolls aren't meant to come up super often in the course of play, and the book continuously reminds you that the game is not shooting for an adversarial relationship between the GM and players. In fact, there's a whole central concept to this game called shaping, and this is the idea that players themselves will add narrative details to make the collective story more evocative and interesting. And they're free to add details that actually help their characters, as long as none of the details contradict the GM's established details or those of the other players. Gameplay is presented as 3 phases. A research phase, where the PCs are typically assigned by the Institute to investigate shenanigans happening in some town or city. This is where most social interaction with NPCs takes place, and where characters will invoke their rolled abilities as well as their class skills. The next phase is called the journey phase, and this is where the PCs seek out the monster in question. This phase is where the journey cards come into place, and PCs will face a number of environmental challenges as well as possibly a few minor creatures. Depending on how well they roll and how deftly they apply their skills, abilities, and interactions, they will affect the chances of a successful encounter with the monster in the encounter phase. The encounter phase is where they meet the monster in question, and they will use all of their resources to try and figure out its behaviors. Each monster has something called threads, and these are an abstraction of their agency and self-determination. Each thread is either intact, severed, or frayed. The way I like to track them is by just using circles and strokes. A circle is an intact thread, one stroke through the circle is a frayed thread, and 2 strokes means that thread is severed. If a party makes a bunch of bad ability rolls and generally makes a mess of things with their skills and interactions, it's possible that all of a monster's threads can become severed, at which point a party does not accomplish its general goal with the entity. As far as getting injured and dying, you can pick up minor and major injuries, and they each add a stacking roll penalty to your traversal checks. It's up to the player and only the player if they want to eventually impose a transformative injury on their character. Again, this game is trying very hard to be as collaborative as possible, so a debilitating or life-changing injury on a PC is ultimately up to the player. It should be noted that these 3 phases of play are not set in stone. You could conceivably start a session with the journey phase or even the encounter phase, or mix them up into hybrid phases. The 3-phase structure is really just a standard template that's probably best for new GMs, and it follows the mission structure of a lot of modern mystery RPGs. I wanted to briefly show you a couple of the locations detailed in the core rulebook so you can get an idea of what the GM has to work with if they don't want to homebrew their own setting. There are 10 culturally and geographically distinct regions in this one continent, and they're largely based on real-world cultures. As a result of that, the creators of the game actually hired no fewer than 6 cultural consultants to ensure some semblance of respect for the actual cultures that were the inspiration for these. Barbecia is a kingdom of dense forests, rolling hills, and swirling rivers on the western edge of Ivasu. The region was originally settled by the Barracks, an agricultural people with animistic beliefs who revered all living entities as possessing souls. Today, Queen Cyrielle Dubois rules the kingdom, investing heavily in knowledge acquisition through the Mappa Mundi Institute and divination schools. One of the most important features of this and all regions is the fact that they're home to 3 major monsters. I don't want to show you all the dozens of monsters in this video because it would be kind of a major spoiler to anyone intending on playing the game, but I have to show you at least one so that you can see how they're presented. They're essentially comprised of a written description at the top, then starting threads, which we discussed earlier, then behaviors, which is a list of features that PCs can sort of discover by using their interactions. For example, the fact that this giant snail monster has the feature cold-blooded can be discovered by chroniclers who have and use the interaction called touch. Each region also has about 4 unique minor creatures. These each have threads and behaviors as well. You can think of them as mini-bosses. If you're running a campaign, you can throw as many of these as you want at players, but if you're running a one-shot of this game, it's advised that you minimize the number of encounters with these minor creatures in a session. Lechnica is a republic famous for its knights, dragons, and fairy tale creatures, featuring vast grasslands managed by mercantile cities and mountain strongholds. The region's current peaceful state emerged after a popular uprising united former enemy factions when a Zmei dragon intervened on behalf of justice. Despite the region's fertile lands, it remains sparsely populated, with most inhabitants concentrated in 2 major cities. The Vodyanik is a waterborne creature that demands offerings and is easily angered. When I prepped my solo run of this game, I centered it around a Vodyanik in Lechnica. Let's actually talk about that solo run. It was really helpful in getting me to understand the GM prep load for this game, as well as where I think this game shines and maybe doesn't shine. There's actually a 20-page solo guide that helps you to understand how to adapt the game's rules into a single-player mode. I won't get too into it, but the idea is that you're meant to act as the GM and run a scenario for 1 to maybe 3 or 4 chroniclers at the most, who you also control, obviously. In order to simulate decision-making by those chroniclers, you assign them lists of inclinations, which are meant to be invoked at major decision points. Otherwise, the game is meant to be run normally, rules-wise, except for the obvious fact that you know the answers to the mystery, and the chroniclers, who also exist inside your head, do not know the answers, at least initially. Let me start with the problems I ran into when simulating this game single-player. Decision point ambiguity. In solo play, determining when to trigger decision points which are these major flashpoints in the fiction, versus when to apply more minor decision making directly, was unclear sometimes. Journey phase randomness. Failed journey phase checks can create cascading difficulties that feel punitive rather than dramatically interesting. Clue failures. Likewise, a failed roll when finding a potential clue means that PCs don't get the clue, which is a common problem in mystery RPGs. Prep load is relatively high. I followed the template laid out in the campaign book for a session, which is to lay out elements for each of the 3 phases, as well as locations, and then the monster and any creatures. Just to give you an idea of the material, the first adventure in the campaign book runs almost 30 pages, and it's not overly wordy or anything. It's all just information that you kind of just need to have in the course of running the session. But I wanted to build my session from the ground up, and that was just a lot of prep. Solo adaptation complexity. Managing archetypes, inclinations, and core mechanics simultaneously can create significant cognitive load for solo play. I tried running 3 chroniclers, and they each had their own character sheet plus a team sheet that contained their inclinations. This was a lot to cross-reference, but that's not a problem with this game as much as it's an issue with any RPG where you're running 3 PCs. There were also some incredible strengths of Mappamundi that I discovered in my playthrough. Meaningful non-combat resolution. The focus on understanding rather than defeating creatures genuinely presented a different kind of gameplay. Success comes from observation, cultural knowledge, and respect rather than optimization and tactics. This is really the biggest selling point of the game. You're hunting down monsters, but only to study and placate them, because ultimately the setting is infused with a sort of hope in humanity that it can emerge from the flux and build a better world. This is an intriguing fantasy to be a part of. Narrative structure is effective. The 3-phase structure creates natural story beats that feel like actual exploration and discovery. There's a reason why mystery RPGs keep going back to this general structure. It emulates what we've seen in television and movies for years, and it has a natural build-up to it that just works. I think if I were to run this game continuously for a group, I'd of course probably mix it up a bit and deviate from the 3 standard phases, but it's a great default session structure. Interconnected mechanics. Information discovered in the research phase directly impacts journey phase difficulty and encounter phase target numbers. This creates satisfying cause and effect chains where choices at every turn matter. Everything sort of stacks towards that final encounter. Cultural depth. This game encourages engagement with interpretations of in-world cultures and folklore in a way that feels authentic. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they brought on half a dozen cultural consultants. Mappamundi dares to ask a radical question. What if the monsters weren't meant to be slain? In a hobby obsessed with power fantasies, this game offers something kind of subversive, a world where curiosity is your greatest weapon and understanding is your ultimate victory. Literally, that's the win condition in all of these adventure scenarios. The game delivers on this promise with conviction. Every mechanic reinforces that knowledge beats violence, making those moments of behavioral discovery feel more satisfying than any critical hit. This isn't just different packaging on familiar mechanics, it's a fundamentally reimagined relationship between player and world. Yes, the rough edges are real, hefty prep, unwieldy solo play, cascading failures, but they're not fatal flaws. They pale beside the game's core achievement, making you genuinely care about creatures as complex beings worthy of respect. That alone makes it worth your attention. I'd love to know your thoughts on this game. If you've read it, played it, or run it, leave your thoughts down in the comments, and thanks as always for watching. I'll see ya.